This is JD Sandoval doing audio log 3 for MALT 604 with Professor Brian Charest. Week 3 of class was pretty fun compared to some of the personal strife that I had going on in my life last week. This week is a lot better. My sister is finally feeling better, and my dad should be home fairly soon. We started this week by discussing the finer points of some of our other projects. More specifically, the case study project, which for that project, I think I am going to use one of the two student technical directors, either Sarah or Ethan. Both students are very intelligent and very responsible, and I think they are going to be very successful in their professional lives and collegiate careers going forward. We also discussed Kumashiro and McLaren, and I know we discussed a lot in class. However, for the life of me, I am having a lot of difficulty remembering it. I do have some things written in my notes. I know for my Thursday class notes, where we discussed the McLaren article further, I have learning as a process of unlearning as one of my more clearer thoughts. And I really like that quote because it reminds me of the Bruce Lee quote regarding emptying your cup. This idea that in order for your cup or your mind to receive new information or water, you must first empty it. Now, while the analogy isn't a perfect one-to-one mind, knowledge, water, cup thing going on, it does ring true in its own respect. Because in order to learn new concepts, it's very important for us to let go of assumptions and preconceived notions that we already have about a topic. And encouraging our students to do that by teaching in a way that encourages this sort of unlearning and learning, I think it's just a good idea. In terms of how to actually put that into practice, I'm not sure. But I really like the idea, and it's something that I'm definitely going to contemplate more in the future. The other point that I remember more clearly about Thursday's class is that we had a discussion for one of the discussion groups, either 5 or 6. I remember it was Casey and Catherine, their group, and we went over one of the articles that we read. The title is hard to pronounce, so I'm not even going to try. But it had a lot to do with English learners and this idea of broken English versus real English, and this idea that even the term broken English feels somewhat derogatory in a few different ways. It talked about Spanish and broken English, and that hit pretty close to home for me because I grew up with my parents and my Mexican grandparents who would use Spanish from time to time. My grandma was notorious for using Spanglish. My grandpa didn't talk as much, so it's a little hard to say. He tried to speak English whenever he spoke, though. This reminds me of a quote and I'm sure I'm going to butcher it, especially since I can't remember who said it. But there's this idea that our native tongue is our true motherland. And it's always been a fascinating idea to me that the language we speak is very much tied to our culture and is in a few ways responsible for our culture, because our language is how we communicate much of our cultural values and traditions to one another. For Mexican Americans, a culture based around Spanglish is going to be a culture that is a very strong mix of American and Mexican traditions and cultural values. For the most part, with some small exceptions, my culture is primarily white with a lot of Mexican American traditions mixed in. And I speak very little Spanish, but I also speak English. And I feel like the amount of Spanish that I speak is somewhat proportional to the amount of Spanish cultural influence in my life. Also, the idea of calo, this language of rebellion, that this kind of like slang version of Spanish, the idea just really intrigued me. And as we discussed it in our group, well, at our table, it just really struck me as the language of a culture of rebellion would be a rebellious language itself. And that has to be one of the more fascinating ideas that I have been recently exposed to. I think I'm going to end this audio log here. I'm trying to keep the length of these audio logs pretty consistent, so this feels about right for a stopping point. I'll see you in the next one.